things. I think one of the interesting things we've observed in multiple sclerosis in recent years is this phenomena that is sometimes referred to as progression independent of relapsing activity. We first described this in an observational data set years ago from the UCSF EPIC study, and we termed it silent progression, referring to insidious deterioration in neurological function that was embedded within relapsing disease. And so this had been something that, hadn't been recognized before. It had been always the assumption that in relapsing MS, disability accumulates as a consequence of poor recovery from clinical relapses, and that later on in the course of the disease, we would see secondary progression. And in fact, what we showed was that this process of insidious worsening begins very early on in the course of the disease at a very low EDSS score, and had not been observed before because of the high frequency of relapses early on in multiple sclerosis that really obfuscated the observation of this insidious decline in function. So once you develop highly effective therapies, and we have highly effective therapies now for treatment in relapsing disease, you suppress the relapsing activity, and guess what? You see this insidious decline in function that begins very early on and seems to be highly consistent with the same phenomena that we observe in secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. So what has been termed secondary progressive MS really is progressive disease that's embedded within relapsing activity. The term progression independent of relapsing activity does characterize this process, I think, quite well in relapsing MS patients, and of course is what underlies disability worsening in primary progressive patients and secondary progressive patients. Whereas the relapse-associated worsening captures the changes that one can sometimes see that are permanent following a severe relapse where recovery can be limited. So these two processes contribute to MS disability. This is now being replicated by multiple groups worldwide and seems to be a true phenomena embedded within multiple sclerosis. And so now, when one is thinking about clinical trials in multiple sclerosis, one has to consider targeting progression independent of relapsing activity, or PIRA, or if you want to call it silent progression, that's fine too. But clearly, if we're going to have an impact there, and if we could, for example, hypothetically with a medication that completely stops those PIRA events, the implication is that you will perhaps never develop secondary progressive multiple sclerosis, right? Because if it's the same process and you completely control it early on when patients are still relapsing, then you should be able to continue to control it all the way through the course of the disease. And from a certain perspective, this may constitute a cure for multiple sclerosis. It would still be a treatment that you would need to be on, but clearly this is the direction where work has to go. And in fact, some of the clinical trials that are ongoing right now are in fact targeting PIRA. So this is very important evolution in our thinking about multiple sclerosis. I think it also, another feature that we have to focus on is the involvement of the spinal cord in this process. And this is something that work done by Roland Henry and others in our group have shown very clearly that the substrate, the anatomical substrate that has the strongest correlation with progression, both in terms of predicting secondary progressive disease as well as predicting progression independent of relapsing activity in relapsing MS patients, has to do with loss of spinal cord tissue, and in particular, the gray matter of the spinal cord. And I think this is a very important point, one that has largely been not adequately studied. We focus so much on the brain and advanced imaging metrics on the brain, but we can do this now with the spinal cord due to breakthroughs in technology. Our capacity to image the spinal cord has improved dramatically over the last 20 years. And so now we can actually deploy spinal cord imaging in randomized controlled trials that are multi-center and either 1.5 or 3 Tesla magnets and gather high quality spinal cord imaging data. And the implication there is very important for trials that are targeting progressive multiple sclerosis. What we've done traditionally to date is take a drug that we hope is going to work and then conduct a $200 million or more study phase 3 trial and hope that it works, cross our fingers, and see what happens on the other end. And for the most part, these studies have failed. Only a couple studies have been successful. The oratorio study with ocrelizumab and the expand study with siponimod. But generally speaking, most trials that target progressive patients have failed. So, and one of the challenges is that we don't have a good phase 2 endpoint. And so having a good phase 2 endpoint in progressive disease seems to me to be a very important unmet need for these types of trials. And I would say that the data on the spinal cord area changes that correlates with PIRA and correlates with the onset of secondary progressive disease offers the opportunity to conduct such studies, a phase 2 trial over 1 year, targeting spinal cord areas that could then be used to conduct multiple trials in progressive disease before one moves on to a phase 3 clinical trial. So I think that's a very important point, and is something that our field needs to pivot toward.